Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Greetings. This is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I would like to articulate a major change in my views on war. It is a change that occurred gradually over the course of several years and culminated in my present position, which I will not hesitate to articulate before going into my reasons. Namely, that position is that I no longer consider war to be acceptable by any parties, against any parties, for any stated or actual justification. My views certainly did not start in this fashion. Indeed, I supported the United States occupation of Afghanistan beginning in 2001. I supported the United States occupation of Iraq beginning in 2003. I believed that both of these occupations, unlike indeed most wars in history, were entered into out of self-defense, were directed toward heinous, brutal, violent, oppressive, totalitarian regimes that did not deserve to exist, and also had at least the potential of greatly increasing the degree of freedom and the standard of living of individuals in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, I was also very pleased, and I still am very pleased, that the Taliban regime in Afghanistan is no longer in power. I am very pleased that Saddam Hussein is dead, because truly this was a monstrous human being. And I do not hesitate to maintain that evil, tyrannical regimes that oppress their own people and that threaten others throughout the world do not deserve to exist. However, my change in view is particularly targeted toward the aspect of war as a proper means of achieving this. I no longer believe that that is the case. The change in my views certainly did not occur overnight. I originally expected the occupations to be quite brief, essentially a matter of deposing the heinous regimes in question, perhaps restoring some basic order and stability, and then pulling out. Of course, a more thorough study of history would have indicated the contrary. The United States still has troops in Korea. It still has troops in Japan, many, many decades after the conflicts in Korea and in Japan completely subsided. So perhaps if history is any guide, because of the United States occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq, our politicians have perhaps inadvertently, perhaps intentionally committed us to decades of a significant military presence in two other areas of the world. Several years into each of these occupations, despite significant initial successes by the U.S. military, I kept reading news reports of continuing conflicts against various groups of insurgents and terrorists, resurgence of opposition to the U.S. occupation, continual chaos in these countries, and I was realizing that the occupations had been mismanaged. And my initial thought was, well, it's just an issue of bad management in the particular case, that if someone more competent had been in charge of these occupations, perhaps they could have been done more effectively. So the initial temptation, and I think many individuals who tracked these occupations via the news had this temptation, is simply to say that the problem lies in the particulars. And yet, there are many instances where advocates of free markets criticize not particular aspects of certain kinds of government initiatives, but the whole idea of a particular kind of government initiative. I think most people today recognize that there are severe problems within the public school system. And most people will also say, well, it's due to a host of case-specific insufficiencies. For instance, underpaid teachers, crowded classes, bad parenting, bad cultural upbringing. One could name perhaps tens, if not hundreds, of these little causes. But a principled opponent of the public education system will say the entire problem is with the whole premise of public education. That is, the whole premise of compulsorily herding young children into classrooms comprised entirely of their peers, rather than the natural way of educating them, which is in the presence of individuals who can actually teach them something, as opposed to their peers, among whom they will most likely simply be reduced to the lowest common denominator. Of course, as long as people are compelled to attend schools and compelled to pay for the schools that the government provides, there are going to continue to be disputes about what should be taught, about what the desired methods of teaching it ought to be, and there will continue to be problems that arise as a result of trying to fit everybody into a particular mold that happens to be decided upon as the outcome of the political process. Education might work if it were left entirely up to the decisions of private citizens, where some would make good decisions, some would make bad decisions, but not everybody would be affected by the failures of one particular system. For more on this topic, please see my video and essay, Commonly Misunderstood Concepts, Education. This concept of public education, irrespective of the particulars, and certainly many sets of particulars have been tried, both left-wing approaches to public education and right-wing approaches to public education, say under the No Child Left Behind bill, or recently with the completely insane reforms proposed by the Texas School Board, have failed and will fail dramatically. I would allege that war, like public education, is one of those kinds of government initiatives that is going to fail dramatically, irrespective of who manages it, for what ostensive or actual purpose it is being conducted, and the myriad particulars of the situation. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, it seemed to me that the stated justification for each of these occupations was among the most virtuous in human history. And indeed, the regimes against which these occupations were conducted were among the most heinous and vicious in all of human history. And yet those occupations have failed miserably. And one indication that they have failed miserably is that they are still continuing, that the problems within those two countries have not abated, and that American troops continue to die, and indeed the civilians in those countries also continue to die. My doubts about the validity of the occupations themselves began with the 2008 Ron Paul campaign for President of the United States. Representative Paul is certainly an extremely persuasive, intelligent, and articulate individual, and one of his stated positions I initially thought seemed to conflict with the rest of his platform. And that position, in my mind at the time, was his very principled and very strong opposition to the various foreign occupations that the United States was engaged in. At the time, I thought that because Dr. Paul was so impressively in accord with my thinking on most of the other issues, I would be willing to simply accept the disagreement on foreign policy. Moreover, I thought that perhaps it would be a good idea to give Dr. Paul's position an empirical test. If the occupations were successful, I reasoned, it would be possible to conclude them in the near future. So I decided to set up a time frame of my own for how long I would tolerate these occupations occurring. And I said that if by early 2009 the United States had not effectively pacified Iraq and Afghanistan, then it would be time to admit the failure of the occupations, cut our losses, and withdraw. Of course, right now, we are more than a year beyond early 2009. For those occupations, there is no end in sight. So how is it that wars for which the justifications were among the most palatable in human history, for which there was a clear good side and a clear evil side, for which the United States had the best military in the world, and troops who mostly came in with the best intentions, for which the United States had some of the most competent leadership in the world. Why did these occupations fail so miserably? I would argue that it is the nature of war itself that led to such absolute failure. Let us consider what it is that war actually accomplishes versus what it is purported to accomplish. Very often the justification for wars is stated as retaliation against aggression, deposition of an evil regime, perhaps a justified claim to a territory or to certain resources, perhaps retribution for certain past offenses. However, what actually happens in war is not the righting of an abstract or concrete but very general geopolitical wrong. Rather, what happens in war is a myriad of particular sufferings. Sufferings by people who did not cause these abstract or very generalized wrongs on the basis of which the wars are supposed to be fought. The wars are fought between the young people of one country or one ethnicity and the young people of another country or ethnicity. These young people did not initiate the conflicts on the basis of which the war is being fought. Indeed, if these young people had met one another in any different context, they might have been good friends. But because of the delusions, I would argue, of the leaders in charge, these young men are forced to take up weapons and shoot one another. Who else suffers in wars? Civilians, on both sides, even in countries that aren't directly affected by wars. Every war has an economic impact. Every war drains resources that could otherwise have been used in peaceful production. I'm not saying that the government should appropriate those resources and use them in civilian social programs. I am saying that the people should keep these resources for themselves. I am saying that they should construct with those resources new buildings, factories, research centers, libraries, not use those resources for carnage and destruction. And of course, the carnage and destruction of war are obvious, but perhaps their effects are not so obvious for many people. Those same buildings and research facilities and factories are also destroyed in mass during war. Vital infrastructure is obliterated, taking certain parts of the world back in time, 50, 100 years, perhaps even back to the Dark Ages, so that people need to start over in rebuilding the basic infrastructure of civilization. And are those people in any way to blame for the supposed wrongs on the basis of which the wars are being fought? It does not seem to be the case. Now, whom are the wars intended to target? Just as whom are various economic sanctions, trade embargoes, other protectionist measures intended to target? They are intended to target the offending leaders of the other country. But whom do they end up targeting? They end up targeting the civilians, the people whom those offending leaders also oppress. And now their oppression is further magnified by these retaliatory measures. Now surely there needs to be a way to punish oppressive leaders. But war, this indiscriminate use of hundreds of thousands of young men to fight and kill tens and hundreds of thousands of other young men, is not the solution. The solution should be much more targeted, much more discriminating, much more precise. It is the difference between firebombing a city and assassinating or capturing only the leader of the country or organization that has initiated aggression and some of that leader's most virulent, sadistic supporters. There is an immense difference here. The latter, I do not believe, requires a declaration of war, nor should it require the involvement of the population or even the country abstractly defined. On the subject of who suffers in war, there is an excellent essay by Desiderius Erasmus, a late 15th and early 16th century Renaissance humanist philosopher who was many, many centuries ahead of his time. The essay is titled Antipolemus, or The Plea of Reason, Religion, and Humanity Against War, and I have linked to it in the references section accompanying this presentation. This essay explores in extremely affecting prose who it is that is actually most significantly set back by war, and it is not the leaders. It is people like you and me. Even here in the United States now, our tax burdens, both present and future, are going to be significantly magnified as a result of the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, what about the extreme case that many proponents of war will bring forth? What about a case of obvious self-defense, where another regime has sent troops to occupy the soil of one's country? Is it then not justified to assemble an army and fight back? I would argue that while fighting back as such may be justified in individual cases, a war, as officially defined, as organized by a government, by a centralized authority, would not be justified. What the government of the occupied country should do instead is focus all of its energies against the leaders of the invading regime. Instead of senselessly killing the rank-and-file troops who have not made the decision to invade, who are simply following orders, why not develop an approach that involves targeted assassinations of the people who masterminded this invasion and this occupation, and meanwhile keep the civilian population out of it. Encourage the civilian population to take shelter, to maybe even flee the country. Certainly this is a much more sensible approach if one is thinking about protecting one's family and one's life and even one's livelihood. The truth is that most people do not have the skills to effectively resist an invading enemy, and moreover, if they were herded into a centralized military force organized from the top down, they would essentially be cannon fodder. Now, if some individuals wish to resist the invasion on their own initiative, say as part of a guerrilla troop, I would have no objection to that. I believe it is the sovereign right of every individual to own and carry firearms, even though I do not myself. And it is the sovereign right of every individual to use these firearms to resist genuine invasions of his life, liberty, and property. However, for most individuals, the most prudent course of action would be to remove themselves from the conflict and to allow individuals who are optimally trained to do so to provide targeted resistance against the leaders of the invasion. Imagine if the troops that are currently being used as rank-and-file infantrymen were instead trained to be commandos who would go in and whose sole mission would be to take out the leaders. And that would end the war. Why is it that the ordinary, peaceful, productive population of both countries needs to suffer, and the politicians and demagogues who incite these wars get away without any penalty whatsoever? Indeed, it would be a just and rather amusing situation if geopolitical disagreements of any sort were settled not by the people of the countries involved, but rather by their leaders in one-on-one duels. Let's put George W. Bush in a cage with Saddam Hussein and see who wins. And then the conflict would be resolved. And it would be universally agreed that whoever wins the conflict would be able to essentially have his way. Of course, as regards the conflict, and not the fates of the civilian population, to whom such squabbles between leaders ought to be entirely irrelevant. As someone who believes in continuing and accelerating progress of human civilization, I find war to be perhaps the most incredibly regressive and destructive and anti-civilizational activity that could be imagined. At no time in human history has there been such massive destruction of infrastructure as during the two world wars. And I do not believe that this should ever recur again. But in order to avoid its recurrence once again, we need to avoid being tempted into explanations for particular wars that might seem just or moral or effective to us, because in its very nature, war cannot be anything but destructive and conducive of some of the greatest misery that is to be found as a consequence of human conduct.
In critiquing John McCain's ideas on foreign policy, I would like to compare them to what I believe are sounder, better ideas on foreign policy. This is especially relevant since John McCain is running as a Republican, and many Republicans have professed admiration for and devotion to the ideas of the American founders.
So it's instructive to examine what the American founders thought was the best foreign policy. And I also happen to think that the founders were correct with regard to their opinion, because they advocated a non-interventionist foreign policy. In his farewell address in 1797, George Washington said, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." 4 years later, in his first inaugural address, Thomas Jefferson echoed that same sentiment and expanded it. He praised equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This is a comprehensive vision of foreign policy, which is focused on international relations in terms of trade, in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of peaceful exchanges, not foreign occupations, not hegemony, not entangling alliances, not being the world's policeman, or trying to conduct the affairs of other nations. Nor was this an isolationist foreign policy. Rather, it was a non-interventionist foreign policy. An isolationist would have Americans keep within America's borders, would cut off trade with the rest of the world. A non-interventionist embraces trade. He embraces learning about other countries and cultures, traveling there, exchanging ideas with people from those countries and cultures, even engaging in peaceful diplomacy of a kind that doesn't require entangling alliances. The problem with entangling alliances is that they tie one's hands. The U.S. government, engaged in entangling alliances, will find itself in situations where its commitment to its allies will have to be placed above its fundamental commitment, which is to protect the rights of American citizens, who delegated certain very specific and limited powers to this government. So, this was the non-interventionist policy outlined by Washington and Jefferson. How did it work? This foreign policy was remarkably successful, as Andrew Jackson acknowledged in his second inaugural address in 1833. That's 32 years after Jefferson gave his first inaugural address, so this foreign policy had some time to work. Jackson said, "The foreign policy adopted by our government soon after the formation of our present Constitution, and very generally pursued by successive administration, has been crowned with almost complete success, and has elevated our character among the nations of the earth. To do justice to all, and submit to wrong from none, has been, during my administration, its governing maxim. And so happy have been its results, that we are not only at peace with the world, but have few causes of controversy, and those of minor importance remaining unadjusted." Can we, in contrast, say about American foreign policy today that it has been a complete success, and that we are at peace with all the world, and that we have few causes of controversy, and those that remain are of minor importance? No, we cannot. Whatever one's views are on foreign policy today, one certainly cannot make these kinds of glowing statements that Andrew Jackson made about the foreign policy pursued by the American founders and the several succeeding generations. Now, a non-interventionist foreign policy, of course, does not mean a pacifistic foreign policy either. It is a foreign policy that is devoted to defense. As Andrew Jackson said, it's a foreign policy that encourages doing justice to all and submitting to wrong from none. An excellent example of this foreign policy in action was the way in which Thomas Jefferson dealt with the Barbary pirates, who were attacking American merchant vessels and capturing crewmen and enslaving them.
What did Thomas Jefferson do? Did he send in a full-fledged force to militarily occupy Tripoli, the haven of the Barbary pirates? No, he did not. Thomas Jefferson used only the means that were necessary to launch an attack on Tripoli, refuse to pay tribute to the Barbary pirates, and show them that attacking American merchant vessels was not a good idea. Thomas Jefferson sent a small contingent of Marines to Tripoli, which happened to be sufficient, by the way, and he also issued letters of marque and reprisal for private individuals to hunt down the Barbary pirates. And it worked. This limited response to a genuine threat helped defend American lives without entangling the U.S. in any kinds of alliances or permanent commitments. Now, 52 years after Andrew Jackson spoke, this non-interventionist foreign policy was still being practiced. President Grover Cleveland, giving his first inaugural address, said the following: "The genius of our institutions, the needs of our people in their home life, and the attention which is demanded for the settlement and development of the resources of our vast territory dictate the scrupulous avoidance of any departure from that foreign policy commended by history, the traditions, and the prosperity of our republic. It is the policy of independence, favored by our position, and defended by our known love of justice and by our power. It is the policy of peace, suitable to our interests. It is the policy of neutrality, rejecting any share in foreign broils and ambitions upon other continents and repelling their intrusion here. It is the policy of Monroe and of Washington and Jefferson. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." So Grover Cleveland explicitly restated Thomas Jefferson's proposal for what a foreign policy ought to be like. Once again, it is a defensive foreign policy, which will result in retaliation if the United States is attacked within its territory. However, this retaliation is also combined with a general posture of armed neutrality and a refusal to entangle and embroil oneself in the affairs of other countries. Furthermore, the American founders and men such as Jackson and Cleveland abhorred conscription, and so did Ronald Reagan, whom many Republicans and conservatives today revere. In 1979, Ronald Reagan wrote the following about conscription: "Conscription rests on the assumption that your kids belong to the state. If we buy that assumption, then it is for the state, not for parents, the community, the religious institutions, or teachers, to decide who shall have what values, and who shall do what work, when, where, and how in our society. That assumption isn't a new one. The Nazis thought it was a great idea." So what I said in my previous presentations about conscription being murder by lottery, about conscription being immoral, not just impractical, is a sentiment that is not all that radical. Ronald Reagan would have agreed with it. John McCain does not agree with it, and that is disturbing, because John McCain deviates from this non-interventionist foreign policy advocated by the founders and by presidents such as Jackson and Cleveland. So if one is going to support McCain, one should at least be honest and announce one's departure from the ideas of the founders. Say that the founders were wrong, and say that one disagrees with the founders. But one is being hypocritical if one praises the founders' ideas and those of McCain in the same breath. I outlined the non-interventionist foreign policy advocated by America's founders, as well as presidents such as Grover Cleveland and Andrew Jackson. John McCain disagrees with these ideas and agrees instead with Theodore Roosevelt's militaristic, jingoistic expansionism. In the second presidential debate in 2008, McCain said outright, "My hero is a guy named Teddy Roosevelt." He gave a greater elaboration of his views of Roosevelt in a speech at the University of Southern California in 2002. McCain said,
Theodore Roosevelt is one of my greatest political heroes. The strenuous life was TR's definition of Americanism, a celebration of America's pioneer ethos, the virtues that had won the West and inspired our belief in ourselves as the new Jerusalem, bound by sacred duty to suffer hardship and risk danger to protect the values of our civilization and impart them to humanity. We cannot sit huddled within our borders, he warned, and avow ourselves merely an assemblage of well-to-do hucksters who care nothing for what happens beyond. Now, the American founders, who advocated peace, commerce, and friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, are called by Teddy Roosevelt well-to-do hucksters, as well as others who follow the ideas of the founders, because they believe in peace and commerce, and not this strenuous life, not our sacred duty to endure hardship and risk and suffering for the sake of the country. Now, America and its civilization have prospered for over 130 years prior to the U.S. undertaking an expansionist foreign policy, without this ideal of the strenuous life being enforced, without the government forcing young men to go overseas and spill their blood for causes that are not their own, and in ways that are not beneficial in the long run to anybody. Teddy Roosevelt, in his speech before the Hamilton Club in Chicago in 1899, said, "If we are to hold our own in the struggle for naval and commercial supremacy, we must build up our power without our own borders." So much for a foreign policy devoted primarily to defense. So much for keeping out of entangling alliances. Because occupying another country is the most entangling kind of alliance one can imagine. Teddy Roosevelt disdained peace and, quote, commercialism, and advocated war, hardship, sacrifice, and militarism. In the same speech before the Hamilton Club, a truly frightening document if you read it, Teddy Roosevelt said, "We cannot, if we would, play the part of China and be content to rot by inches in ignoble ease within our borders, taking no interest in what goes on beyond them, sunk in a scrambling commercialism, heedless of the higher life, the life of aspiration, of toil and risk, busying ourselves only with the wants of our bodies for the day." He further said, "A life of slothful ease, a life of that peace which springs merely from lack either of desire or of power to strive after great things, is as little worthy of a nation as of an individual. I ask only that what every self-respecting American demands from himself and from his sons shall be demanded of the American nation as a whole." There are so many things wrong with these statements. First of all, a nation is not an entity in its own right. Teddy Roosevelt is reifying it here, thinking of it as something apart from the individuals constituting it. Second, Teddy Roosevelt denigrates peace and comfort and commercialism, trade, which bring to us all the economic, cultural, social, emotional benefits of civilization. He believes that there's something else, something greater than the everyday virtues toward which we aspire routinely. And he denigrates those everyday virtues, denigrates them as too mundane, not noble enough, not glorious enough. And instead of our attempts to strive for peaceful, comfortable, fulfilling everyday lives, he advocates war, hardship, sacrifice, suffering, bloodshed, the elimination of everything desirable that we strive for on an everyday basis. And that, I submit, is abhorrent. Teddy Roosevelt says, "We do not admire the man of timid peace. We admire the man who embodies victorious effort, the man who never wrongs his neighbor, who is prompt to help a friend, but who has those virile qualities necessary to win in the stern strife of actual life." Now, there's nothing wrong with never wronging one's neighbor or helping one's friend. But Teddy Roosevelt clearly sees certain virile qualities which are apart from that. If America today has a problem with machismo, this man, I believe, is one of the contributing factors. Because he believes that conventional bourgeois morality of honesty, decency, integrity, the willingness to better one's own life and the lives of those around one, that's not enough. One needs something else, according to Roosevelt. And a person who is gentle, who is civil, who is courteous, who is mild-mannered, is the man of timid peace. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't even believe that that's a real man. He wants a real man to be tough and destructive. But why? Why is it a virtue of manliness to want to go out and destroy things and shoot them up? I don't understand. Teddy Roosevelt said, "When men fear work or fear righteous war, well it is that they should vanish from the earth, where they are fit subjects for the scorn of all men and women who are themselves strong and brave and high-minded." Now, it's not just war that Teddy Roosevelt extols. He condemns even the fear of war. He believes that even recognizing the horrors of war and being reluctant to enter into them is a vice. No, he wants gung-ho jingoism. He wants people to gladly march off onto war, as did many young men prior to World War I, thinking it was going to be some romantic adventure. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, greatly spurred on this kind of enthusiasm, and these men were mowed down by the tens and hundreds of thousands in the trenches, not knowing what they were in for. This is what this crazy, fearless attitude results in. Furthermore, Teddy Roosevelt condemned the timid man, the lazy man, the man who distrusts his country, the over-civilized man who has lost the great fighting, masterful virtue. These are the men, he said, who fear the strenuous life. So being over-civilized is bad, according to Teddy Roosevelt. Is it not the great goal of all of us ordinary, decent human beings to try to become more civilized, to try to acquire better standards of living, higher culture, a better understanding of the human condition? Teddy Roosevelt denigrates all of this. He thinks there can be too much civilization. Instead, he favors the primitive, aggressive man who likes to tear things apart and beat people over the head with clubs. It's a disgusting view of what is desirable. And furthermore, Teddy Roosevelt, as most historians will admit, was one of the only few American presidents who saw war not as a necessary evil, but as actually a positive good. He glorified war as an opportunity rather than an occasion of great devastation. He said, if there is not the war, you don't get the great general. If there is not a great occasion, you don't get a great statesman. If Lincoln had lived in a time of peace, no one would have known his name. Well, I submit to you that having tens or hundreds of thousands of people die in a war is far too high a price to pay for getting a great general or a great statesman. Roosevelt doesn't think so, of course. And moreover, if Lincoln had lived in a time of peace, we would all be much better off, because Lincoln was exactly the kind of warmongering leader whom we don't want in office again. He instituted a draconian form of conscription. He suspended habeas corpus. He jailed his intellectual opponents just for criticizing him. And the Civil War primarily was not fought over the issue of slavery. It was fought in order to essentially prevent secession from the Union by the southern states. Previously, in this presentation, I discussed how John McCain's ideas on foreign policy deviated from those of the American founders and agreed instead with the jingoistic expansionism of people like Teddy Roosevelt. Now, I continue this investigation into whose ideas are McCain's ideas the most like. One other person that comes to mind is Woodrow Wilson, who got the United States into World War I after being elected under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He agreed with McCain and Teddy Roosevelt on many foreign policy issues. For instance, in his war message on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson said, armed neutrality, it now appears, is impracticable. Never mind the 140-odd years of American history where armed neutrality was practiced and quite practicable, despite the fact that Europe erupted in periodic major conflicts, and America stayed out of them and everything was fine from Americans' standpoints. Never mind that. It's now all of a sudden impracticable. Furthermore, Wilson said, we are at the beginning of an age in which it will be insisted that the same standards of conduct and responsibility for wrong done shall be observed among nations and their governments that are observed among the individual citizens of civilized states. So, what happened to non-interventionism, neutrality, keeping out of foreign alliances? Now the United States, according to Wilson, has a moral responsibility to enforce proper conduct among all the nations of the world. That is truly a radical departure from the kind of foreign policy that the founders recommended. And furthermore, Wilson said that a steadfast concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. Now, this of course led to the failed League of Nations, which was a precursor to the United Nations. So, who else would have agreed with John McCain in principle on foreign policy? Franklin Roosevelt, who instituted the first peacetime military draft in 1940 and eagerly entered the United States into World War II, agreed with McCain, Theodore Roosevelt, and Wilson. He said, even prior to World War II, at the beginning of the New Deal, the American people must march forward as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. At one point in time, I put this quote, along with two quotations from Hitler and Mussolini, on a forum, and asked people to identify the authors of each quotation. Essentially, an undertaking of matching the authors to the statements. And until I gave the answers, nobody could guess the correct answer, because the quotations from Hitler, Mussolini, and FDR were so similar. You can guess the answers yourself when you watch my video, Franklin Roosevelt and the Fascists. Furthermore, in a disturbing address called A Call to Sacrifice from 1942, Franklin Roosevelt said, "The price for civilization must be paid in hard work and sorrow and blood. The price is not too high." And both McCain and Teddy Roosevelt would agree that the price for civilization is to be paid in sorrow and blood. Now, I do think civilization requires hard work to create, but it does not require sorrow and blood. It does not require destroying things, because civilization is primarily about building things, about creating things, about engaging in peaceful, productive work, commerce, cultural exchange, running a business, raising a family. That is what civilized life is about, not going to war and destroying things. So FDR is wrong, dangerously, devastatingly wrong here. Now, a disturbing part of FDR's call to sacrifice is, I think, a foreshadowing of what would happen under a McCain presidency. FDR said, "This great effort must be carried through to its victorious conclusion by the indomitable will and determination of the people as one great whole." Once again, a reification of a collectivity. "It must not be impeded by the faint of heart," the men of timid peace whom Teddy Roosevelt condemned. "It must not be impeded by those who put their own selfish interests above the interests of the nation." Hence McCain's call to put country first above all else, and have people sacrifice their own self-interests to the interests of the nation. "It must not be impeded by those who pervert honest criticism into falsification of fact." So those dissenters who criticize the policy of the government are now all of a sudden guilty of falsifying fact. That must not be allowed to happen. "It must not be impeded by self-styled experts, either in economics or military problems, who know neither true figures nor geography itself." So when somebody criticizes the government and has actual evidence that the government's policy is failing from either an economic or a logistical perspective, all of a sudden that person is discredited. He's just a self-styled expert who doesn't really know, even though he pretends to know. Of course, one of the great tasks of government during a war effort is to use propaganda to attempt to discredit the opposition by any means, including ad hominem attacks such as this one. It must not be impeded by a few bogus patriots who use the sacred freedom of the press to echo the sentiments of the propagandists in Tokyo and Berlin. So, wait a minute. When somebody thinks he's genuinely patriotic, and he loves his country and he wants his country to be kept out of war, and he wants the inhabitants of his country to be safe, he's all of a sudden a bogus patriot who is somehow mysteriously echoing the sentiments of propagandists in Tokyo and Berlin. And above all, it shall not be imperiled by the handful of noisy traitors, betrayers of America, betrayers of Christianity itself, would-be dictators, who in their hearts and souls yielded to Hitlerism and would have this republic do otherwise. So, noisy traitors are people who oppose the government's war effort, who don't think that the war is being rightly conducted or ought to be conducted at all, even though they may have the best motives in mind, and they may in fact believe that not having the war would be better in terms of everyone's interests. Those are traitors. That is how dissent is treated under a wartime government, be it American or otherwise. And if John McCain has his way and there are more wars, you can bet that dissenters will be treated in the same way. Franklin Roosevelt, during the war, exercised a virtual totalitarian control over the lives of civilians. He deported hundreds of thousands of innocent American citizens of Japanese descent into concentration camps. He censored the press. He imposed a 100% income tax on all incomes above $25,000. And, of course, he murdered hundreds of thousands, about 400,000 Americans, because he instituted a policy of conscription. So this is the kind of intellectual influence that McCain's ideas on foreign policy have. If you support this foreign policy out of principle, then you should also be able to say, out of principle, that you agree with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, and disagree with the American founders, and disagree with Andrew Jackson and Grover Cleveland and Ronald Reagan, because that is where the battle lines are drawn. You can either have peace, commerce, honest friendship with all nations, or you can have this kind of warmongering, sacrifice-mongering, perpetual devastation, advocated in favor of the strenuous life. I believe that the latter is completely unacceptable and will completely ruin our civilization and its future hopes for progress. John McCain's view of foreign policy and its antecedents in the views of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt are grievously, devastatingly wrong. What is the alternative? It is the non-interventionist foreign policy advocated by the American founders, the policy of peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, in the words of Jefferson. Further implications of this kind of foreign policy were stated by Richard Cobden, a 19th century British classical political economist, free trade activist, and a great man who achieved the repeal of the British Corn Laws. He offers eloquent words on the proper foreign policy and its effects. Cobden wrote, "The progress of freedom depends more upon the maintenance of peace, the spread of trade, and the diffusion of education than upon the labors of cabinets and foreign ministers." He further wrote that peace will come to earth when the people have more to do with each other and governments less. So for all of you who are worried about national security, worried about another terrorist attack, worried about international hostilities, remember Cobden's words. When people have more to do with each other and governments less, there will be more peace. The more governments stay out of foreign policy, the less they intervene, the more chances people have to interact with one another peacefully. Cobden said that England, by calmly directing her undivided energies to the purifying of her own internal institutions, to the emancipation of her commerce, would, by thus serving as it were for the beacon for other nations, aid more effectually the cause of political progression all over the continent than she could possibly do by plunging herself into the strife of European war. And it worked, until 1914, of course, when England entangled herself in the ultimate devastation of World War I. But fighting a war, occupying a foreign country, embroiling oneself in very difficult and bloody conflicts is not the way to achieve peace. The way to achieve peace is to lead by example, to have a free society where individual rights are respected, where commerce is valued, where culture is valued, and where these are spread to the remainder of the world through peaceful interactions, through suggestions and examples and urgings that other countries follow the same path, but not through violence. Cobden said, "I have been accused of looking too much to material interests. I believe that the physical gain will be the smallest gain to humanity from the success of this principle. I look farther. I see in the free trade principle that which shall act on the moral world as the principle of gravitation in the universe, drawing men together, thrusting aside the antagonism of race and creed and language, and uniting us in the bonds of eternal peace. I believe that the effect will be to change the face of the world so as to introduce a system of government entirely distinct from that which now prevails. I believe that the desire and the motive for large and mighty armies, for gigantic empires and great navies will die away. I believe that such things will cease to be necessary, or to be used when man becomes one family, and freely exchanges the fruits of his labor with his brother man. I believe that the speculative philosopher of 1,000 years hence will date the greatest revolution that ever happened in the world's history from the triumph of the principle which we have met here to advocate. What is that principle that will bring about peace and security and prosperity to all? It is precisely that commercialism which John McCain and Theodore Roosevelt so fervently decry. This commercialism, this expansion of trade and peaceful interaction, is the solution to virtually all of the United States foreign policy problems today. Consider, the more people have an opportunity to peacefully interact with one another, to exchange goods and services, the more opportunities people have to find out good things about one another, things to like. Not just things to hate, not just things for which they would be willing to bash in the other person's head. Because military propaganda during the time of war often incites that kind of hate. Even in so-called free countries such as the United States, war propaganda had that impact, considering how Germans were perceived during both World Wars, how the Japanese were perceived during World War II, and in many circles how Arabs are perceived today. And instead of hating these people, I believe that all Americans should attempt to find what is the best about them, and try to benefit from that through trade, through peaceful exchange. And furthermore, when many people who are currently living in unfree societies see the benefits of trade of the United States with everyone, including Cuba, Iran, and North Korea, when they see these benefits, they will begin to accept Western lifestyles and Western ways of thinking. And their current oppressive regimes, which do pose a threat to security today, will become intolerable to them, and they will throw them off. And the United States will not need to expend a single drop of blood to achieve this. It can be achieved quite peacefully, quite sanely and rationally, gradually. But I believe that if this principle is implemented, Islamic fundamentalism will disappear within 20 years. In the Middle East, virtually everybody will recognize that the United States is not out to get them. That indeed, American prosperity, American freedoms, can be exercised by all human beings, provided that this prosperity and these freedoms are communicated through peaceful interaction. John McCain does not get this. John McCain has explicitly admitted on many occasions that he is completely economically ignorant, that he doesn't know anything about economics or its relationship to human affairs. Do we want this man as president? This man who would have us bomb Iran as a foreign policy solution? This man who would spend 100 years in Iraq? This man who continually preaches sacrifice, hardship, and war as virtues? I do not believe that the United States can withstand such a president.
Thank you very much to Young Americans for Liberty for inviting me to speak tonight. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and today I'll be presenting my personal view in opposition to war. I consider war to be the greatest enemy of human progress. So my current view, which will seem a rather extreme view to many, war is not acceptable by any parties, against any parties, for any stated or actual justification. And I will say that has not always been my view. And indeed, I was fortunate enough never to have personally experienced the horrors of war, unlike Professor Woody, who spoke to you earlier tonight. And I hope that as few people as possible get to personally experience the horrors of war in the future. But that was not always the position that I held. Indeed, when the U.S. occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq were starting, I supported them. I supported them for many years, even when they began to get bogged down and seem interminable. And I thought I had moral reasons for supporting those occupations. I thought that they were primarily undertaken in self-defense. I thought that they were directed against evil regimes or evil organizations like Al-Qaeda. I thought that as a result, the occupations could improve people's lives by reforming the governments and sometimes even the customs and societal structures in those areas. And I thought, of course, that the entities against whom these occupations were directed were moral monsters like the Taliban in Afghanistan, or Osama bin Laden, or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And it is true from a standpoint of individual rights, those organizations have committed a lot of atrocities. They have violated the lives of many innocent people. And from the standpoint of morality, I would agree they have no right to commit those atrocities. Those regimes had no right to exist. They have no right to exist. But in terms of considering what to do about it, war is perhaps the worst possible response. And I realize that in retrospect. I realized that my initial expectations regarding how the Iraq and Afghanistan wars would turn out were completely mistaken. I expected both of those wars to be very brief, very effective, and to result in minimal casualties, at least on the American side. I sought to extrapolate from the exponentially declining record of American casualties in prior wars. If you try to draw a curve between, say, the casualties in World War II, the casualties in Vietnam, the casualties in the first Persian Gulf War, I thought circa late 2002, well, if the United States tried to topple Saddam Hussein again, there would be approximately 10 casualties. And of course, that didn't turn out to be that way, not even close. And that's not to say the American military wasn't terrifyingly effective in its combat roles. The United States has by far the most powerful military in the world. But despite military successes on the battlefield, these occupations would not end year after year. So in the face of that seeming empirical refutation of my original position, my initial interpretation was, well, from a moral standpoint, the occupations were still proper, but they were mismanaged. And with better leaders, with better specific decisions, perhaps they could have been done right. They could have been concluded successfully. And yet, I think the greater conceptual realization that I came to over time is some kinds of government initiatives are bound to fail based on their fundamental premises, irrespective of their particular attributes. The very pursuit of undertakings like war is self-defeating. And I will emphasize, this is not an attack on one particular political party or the other. As Professor Woody pointed out, both Republican presidents and Democratic presidents have entangled the U.S. in numerous foreign occupations. The Second Iraq War was begun by a Republican president, but essentially continued throughout the tenure of a Democratic president, and now another Republican president has inherited it, and I don't think he's going to wind it down. And furthermore, from at least some standpoints, you could say there were strong moral reasons to oppose the Taliban, to oppose Al-Qaeda, to oppose Saddam Hussein. And there was a great deal of organization. There was a great deal of tactical and strategic brilliance on the part of U.S. military command. And in spite of all that, the occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan failed miserably. And you might say, well, Saddam Hussein is out of power, at least that's good. The Taliban is not in charge in Afghanistan, at least that's good. But if those occupations didn't fail, why are they still continuing? Why is the United States continuing to embroil its personnel, its resources, and its very political stability in perpetuating these conflicts? So, as with many fundamental shifts in worldview, they don't occur overnight. They occur as responses to an accumulation of evidence. And one large factor in eventually tipping the scales and shifting my position was the 2008 presidential campaign of Ron Paul. And I was a college student at the time. I was attracted to Ron Paul's campaign for a variety of reasons. I liked his economic policy. I liked his support of domestic individual civil liberties. I liked his general erudition and civility and intellectualism. And I didn't always see eye to eye on him. And I supported him in spite of his views on foreign policy. But I tried to give those views a fair hearing because I was impressed by the overall presentation of Ron Paul's ideas. So I tried to engage those views and try to understand his arguments and subject them to an empirical test. I thought, well, perhaps those occupations with some justification should be given a chance to be successfully concluded, kind of the peace with honor viewpoint. So my empirical test was, certainly by early 2009, there would have been more than enough time for those occupations to have been successfully concluded if there was ever a chance for them to be successfully concluded. So my empirical test was if they didn't successfully wind down by early 2009, then it would be time to cut our losses, admit failure, and withdraw, instead of just sending in more good money after bad and wasting more infinitely valuable human lives. However, as you know, U.S. troops are still in Afghanistan and Iraq. So clearly, by that empirical test, those occupations also failed miserably. And then in late 2009, I saw the collateral murder video that was released by WikiLeaks through the large information leak that was made possible by Chelsea Manning. And that video really shook me because it dispelled any illusions I had about American moral exceptionalism in war. That's not to say that the American military is uniquely horrible in some way. It's just that there could no longer be any pretense that the American military was immune from committing the kinds of atrocities that have been ubiquitously committed by all armies throughout human history. And that's not to say most soldiers are evil people or ill-intentioned people, quite the contrary. But you are going to have those bad apples. You are going to have people who not only kill innocents and regret it or try to justify it as unfortunate but necessary collateral damage. You are going to have some people who gleefully rejoice at the murder of innocents. And when you have a war, that behavior is going to be enabled, and in some respects it's going to be unstoppable. And that is a type of moral transgression that I could never bring myself to tolerate. So that brings up a key question in this entire discussion. The question of intention versus reality. What does war actually accomplish as opposed to what it is desired that war accomplish? Common justifications for wars are manyfold. They include retaliation against aggression, deposition of evil regimes, justified claim to a territory or resources or a perceived justified claim, or retribution for past wrongs, whether real or subjectively perceived. Yet, for all of those abstract justifications that some people can articulate, the actual consequences of war are concrete suffering. And indeed, in practice, wars are fought among innocent young people to fulfill the geopolitical fantasies of a small group of deluded old people. Certainly not the vast majority of old people who are just as powerless as the young people, but a few who are in the political elite who have the ability to send hundreds of thousands or millions of young people to their deaths. And the tragic part of it is the combatants in a war on opposite sides might have been good friends in any other context. There's no reason why a random young person from the United States shouldn't befriend a random young person from Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq. And it's a sheer tragedy that war forces them to shoot at one another. And also civilians on both sides of a war suffer. Even if they avoid the most direct consequences like a war destroying their neighborhoods or depriving them of their relatives, they still have to sacrifice resources that rightfully should belong to them. We will be bearing the economic burdens of the Iraq and Afghanistan occupations for decades to come. And war is an immense hindrance to the material progress of human civilization. All of those roads and bridges that get destroyed, all of those habitable buildings that are no longer habitable, factories that can no longer produce goods for human beings to enjoy. What art is not created because of a war? What scientific research is not conducted because a war is underway? How far back in time would you like to be taken because a war destroys your immediate surroundings? It could be 50 years, it could be 100 years or more. An entire city is leveled to the ground, and people in that area have to start over rebuilding that city. That could take decades or centuries for that area to return to its former prominence and vibrancy. So the innocent suffer most in war. In the meantime, the politicians are seldom themselves adversely affected. Often they're even benefited if in a time of crisis they can posture as the champions of the people, rally them, say that they are advancing some great cause or protecting some great ideal. Wars ostensibly are a response to transgressions by national leaders like Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad. But in practice, they harm the very people whom those leaders also oppress. Think about ordinary Iraqi civilians or ordinary Syrian civilians. They probably suffered as much from the U.S. occupations and U.S. military interventions as they did from the tyrannies of Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad. And I think a fairer way, a more justified way, if two national leaders have a problem with one another, is to have them fight it out personally. Or if they fear an imbalance of physical strength, well, perhaps Donald Trump shouldn't be in the same ring with Bashar al-Assad. I don't think that would end very well. They could designate champions to essentially contest whatever issues are at stake and leave the ordinary civilian population out of it. I think from a standpoint of moral justice, there should be ways for oppressive regimes to get their comeuppance, but war is a terrible way of achieving that. I even think economic sanctions are a terrible way of achieving that because they again harm the ordinary people who also suffer from those regimes.
So eliminating evil regimes is not a question of war. It's not a matter among peoples or countries. Probably the best way is to facilitate general civilizational progress, economic and philosophical progress that leads the people in those areas to themselves depose those regimes. And furthermore, I would say it's any person's right to defend their own lives and their own property. If some Syrian individual whose family had been murdered by Bashar al-Assad decided to assassinate him, I wouldn't terribly mind. But it is not the job of the US government or the US military to undertake that type of effort. Desiderius Erasmus was a great late 15th century, early 16th century Renaissance humanist philosopher, and he wrote an excellent essay that I would recommend to you called Anti-Polemus, or The Plea of Reason, Religion, and Humanity Against War. I'd like to read an excerpt from this essay, though I do encourage you to locate it online. It's freely available, and it is quite affecting prose. Erasmus wrote, "Peace is at once the mother and the nurse of all that is good for man. War, on a sudden, and at one stroke, overwhelms, extinguishes, abolishes, whatever is cheerful, whatever is happy and beautiful, pours a foul torrent of disasters on the life of mortals. Peace shines upon human affairs like the vernal sun. The fields are cultivated, the gardens bloom. The cattle are fed upon 1,000 hills. New buildings arise, riches flow, pleasures smile, humanity and charity increase. Arts and manufactures feel the genial warmth of encouragement, and the gains of the poor are more plentiful. But no sooner does the storm of war begin to lower than what a deluge of miseries and misfortunes seizes, inundates, and overwhelms all things within the sphere of its action. The flocks are scattered, the harvest trampled, the husbandmen butchered, villas and villages burnt, cities and states that have been ages rising to their flourishing state, subverted by the fury of one tempest, the storm of war. So much easier is the task of doing harm than of doing good, of destroying than of building up." And when I read these words, I think not much has changed conceptually about the harms of war. Perhaps the technology of war is even more destructive today on an even more massive scale. But what Erasmus wrote about is universally true about war. It's true about every war. And if you think about how much easier it is to destroy than to build up, think of Aleppo in Syria, which for millennia was a cultural center, a center of arts, a center of commerce, and now it's a smoldering ruin because of war. There are no good sides in a war. There are no good sides in the conflict in Syria. And I would caution anyone against the temptation to try to abstractly justify a war, because war is concrete suffering. And it's concrete suffering that can be illustrated in concrete figures. Even as far back as March 2013, the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University estimated the cost of the Iraq War up to that point to be $1.7 trillion. They also estimated that by 2053, if you consider all of the ongoing costs, including the costs, for instance, of medical care, rehabilitation for the veterans that were affected, those costs would rise to $6 trillion. Now, on the other hand, in Mountain View, California, there's a biogerontologist named Aubrey de Grey who has an initiative called SENS, Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. And he has essentially identified the 7 principal causes of damage to human cells that accumulates over time with biological age. He has stated publicly that if he were to receive between $30 to $100 million of funding per year for the next 20 years, he would have about a 50% probability of achieving what is called longevity escape velocity, where in the future, because of medical advances, life expectancies will advance by more than 1 year with each year that passes. So let's take that $100 million estimate, the upper end of his range, multiplied by 20 years. You have $2 billion. $2 billion to have a 50% chance of achieving potentially indefinite lifespans versus $6 trillion, which is what the United States is going to incur in terms of the costs of the Iraq War. For 1/3,000 of the cost of a single war, we could be extending human lifespans indefinitely rather than needlessly destroying human lives. That is the absurdity of war. And that is the absurdity of the misdirection of resources that war implies. And there are so many other better priorities. Biomedical research of all sorts, curing diseases, enabling better prosthetics, space colonization. The cost of that would be in the many billions of dollars rather than millions of dollars, but still a lot lower than the Iraq War ended up costing. Domestic infrastructure. In many areas of the country, we do have failing roads and bridges. Wouldn't it be better to fix them, to provide something useful for people to employ in their day-to-day lives, rather than destroying infrastructure far away? Autonomous and electric vehicles. Developing more of those could save tens of thousands of lives per year in the United States alone that are lost due to human error causing automobile crashes. And electric vehicles, as Professor Woody pointed out, could reduce the United States' dependence on foreign oil and might reduce the incentive to engage in future foreign occupations. 3D printing technologies, which could create a wide array of goods, from everyday consumer goods, from, say, a tabletop 3D printer, to even entire houses. There are startups in various countries now that are experimenting and have successfully been able to create prototypes of 3D printed housing. Why not invest in building up rather than destroying? I would say the best policy solution going forward would be to institute major cuts to defense spending, use the resulting savings to pay off the national debt. After that, tax rates could be lowered dramatically. All those resources that are being wasted in war right now could be returned to the people, who could use it to catalyze economic and technological progress. And I'll also note with regard to Syria in particular, because this is a looming conflict, we do not know how exactly President Trump is going to react when he perceives the next provocation from any of the many sides in that conflict. There are no good sides. It's true, Bashar al-Assad is a murderer, irrespective of whether he is responsible for one particular chemical attack or conventional attack. He has the blood of a lot of innocent civilians on his hands. But the same can be said of the al-Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda affiliated group, certainly of ISIS, and of the so-called Free Syrian Army, which is somewhere between a myth and an agglomeration of ragtag warlord groups that appropriate that label in order to get funding from the United States and other Western governments. But look up the Free Syrian Army on Wikipedia, because there's a section there about atrocities committed by that group or in the name of that group. For instance, on March 20th, 2012, Human Rights Watch issued an open letter to the Syrian opposition, including the Free Syrian Army, accusing them of carrying out kidnappings, torture, and executions, and calling on them to halt these unlawful practices. The FSA has been accused of summarily executing numerous prisoners whom it claimed to be government soldiers. A rebel commander in Damascus had said that over the months his unit had executed perhaps 150 people whom his military council found to be informers. That's some due process for you. Also, the Daoud Battalion, operating in the Jabal al-Zawiya area, has reportedly used captured soldiers in proxy bombings. This involved tying the captured soldier into a car loaded with explosives and forcing him to drive to an army checkpoint where the explosives would be remotely detonated. So, in essence, the United States and other Western governments have been funding these military groups that use involuntary suicide bombers to accomplish their political objectives. And this is being done at great geopolitical risk, at risk of escalating tensions with Russia, because the Putin regime, for whatever reasons, might align itself with different sides. Such an escalation of tensions is dangerous from the standpoint of the survival of human civilization, because a misunderstanding in a moment of mutual suspicion and heightened conflict could lead to nuclear war. It has happened many times during the Cold War that humankind was on the brink of a nuclear confrontation, and it was only because cooler heads were able to prevail and make a decision to draw back from the brink of that we are still alive today. And I wonder, though, in the future, will there be cooler heads to make that decision, or will a different decision be made? So, with that being said, I will be open for questions. One interesting question that I'd be happy to take if anybody wants to ask me this is, what about the extreme case if our country is invaded by a foreign army? If, like in that video you saw, there are foreign troops in Texas, is war justified then? But I'll leave it to you to decide how you want to approach this subject and what you would like to inquire about. Yes?
Yes, I'm going to take the bait.
Okay.
Sort of. So, do you think World War II would be justifiable because those two countries didn't have the capability of taking over essentially the entire world? And those were clearly evil regimes that killed millions of people.
Absolutely. They were clearly evil regimes. I would say they were the product of prior ill-fated interventionist decisions as well. One could think about what might have happened had Woodrow Wilson kept his promise to keep the U.S. out of World War I, and then perhaps World War I would have drawn to a stalemate. There would have been no Treaty of Versailles. There would have been some more equitable settlement. Perhaps there wouldn't have been the kinds of grounds for resentment in Germany that got Hitler into power. But suffice it to say, from any given standpoint, we have to make a decision based on how history has turned out up to that time. And I would say, in the extreme case, if there's an invasion by a foreign army, if there are literally troops marching down the streets, pillaging, taking lives, destroying property, self-defense is a right. If somebody shows up at your doorstep and says, we want to take everything, you do have the moral right to defend yourself. I just question whether it should be done through a centralized organization that forces people to die on command. And there could be a resistance that doesn't rise to the level of war. The government of the occupied country could target the leaders. I would have no problem with the occupied United States, the government, let's say, organizing a team of commandos to try to infiltrate Adolf Hitler's compound and assassinate him. In fact, there were several failed assassination attempts on Hitler's life among the German high command. So it was clearly at least a conceivable tactic to deploy. And furthermore, even in the case of an invasion, the rank-and-file troops are typically just following orders. There are a few sadists among them, and if they do try to interfere with your life, of course you have the right to fight back. However, the real problem wears a suit or a uniform and sits in a palace somewhere. So my suggestion is keep civilians out of intergovernmental squabbles altogether. Even if you're organizing a resistance, leave the resistance to the professionals. People would have the right to band together in self-defense. But it wouldn't be this concept of a war between nations or between peoples. One of the greatest tragedies of modernity is this concept of total war, the idea that it's not just King X versus King Y trying to battle it out for territory or prestige or whatnot. It's the German people versus the French people, and somehow their patriotism, their pride, their national identity are entangled in this. And they don't have to be. There's this kind of spiral where people try to use escalating means in order to win at all costs. So, in a sense, I'm advocating a return to more of a code of rules-based engagement, a kind of restraint where you could have two champions have a stylized fight, and in our age it might even be an electronic combat of some sort, and all sides agree this resolves the geopolitical crisis. We will go no further, we will acquiesce to the demands of the winning side. Now, can there be enough restraint and enough recognition that that is a more optimal outcome than using any means necessary? That's an open question, but I think that's why we're having these discussions. And I would say also an important consideration is only very few people can actually fight well. Most of us are quite terrible at it. And armies turn people into cannon fodder, in essence. They turn people into disposable pawns that go somewhere on the battlefield on command and might have to be sacrificed for a kind of larger tactical or strategic purpose.
That's not right, even if you're in your own country defending what you perceive to be your homeland or your community. Why should you be in a position where you're risking your very well-being? If you value your life, of course, you should try to preserve that which you value, but not at the cost of itself. So that would be my answer. It's not a clear-cut answer in the sense that I'm not going to tell you how to defeat Hitler if he were to invade this country. I think if we figured that out, we wouldn't be having that discussion. But my broader answer is there are better ways and worse ways of going about it. Yes?
So kind of like what I asked Woody was, how do you get people to kind of understand this threat abroad when it's not here? But it is here in a way, because we've actually had to give up many civil liberties due to the war in the Middle East, and always through wars that we've had in history. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, kind of shed some light on liberties that we have lost, and like how the government has become more involved in our lives because of the war.
I remember what it was like to fly on an airplane before September 11th, 2001. I remember that it was a relatively unobtrusive experience from the standpoint of, you went through a metal detector, somebody would put your bags through an x-ray machine. Generally, there was nothing else. And no questions asked, no scrutiny of you as a potential criminal or terrorist, which is, from a statistical standpoint, quite ridiculous to screen everybody when a small minority of people are even remotely inclined toward such criminal acts. And I also remember an era before mass surveillance of everybody's communications, before the chilling effect that that has had when essentially, if you digest the disclosures that Edward Snowden made in 2013, every email you send, everything you type into most search engines, every social media post you make, you should really structure it with a little inkling in the back of your head that, yes, the NSA could be somehow processing it, maybe not directly looking at what you wrote, but feeding it through some sort of algorithm, and if it generates the wrong frequency of keywords that is somehow associated with the keywords used by nefarious individuals, you might be flagged for further scrutiny. That can have a chilling effect. That can have a chilling effect on what you choose to do with your life, on what you choose to disclose to other people. And I would say the mentality that exists is very disproportionate in terms of its focus on the real risks. So you are a lot likelier to die in an automobile accident and far likelier to die of, say, cancer or heart disease, or if you live long enough, Alzheimer's disease, than you are of a terrorist attack. You are likelier to die of a lightning strike or falling out of your bed in the morning than you are of a terrorist attack. Yet, because of all of this incessant focus on the crimes of a small number of people, I would say the damage those crimes have done to the mindset of Americans and how they approach everyday life has been even out of proportion with the damage that those crimes have done to actual American lives. And when people say, essentially, we cannot sacrifice our liberties or else the terrorists have won, that is essentially what I believe has happened, unfortunately, to America's civic culture. There's a kind of fortress mentality now, in essence, that anybody potentially could be a terrorist unless we subject them to extreme vetting. And let's say, taking the situation of Syrian refugees, if there is even the remotest probability that 1 out of 100,000 Syrian refugees could do something nefarious if we allow them into the country, we should just ban them. We should prevent them from entering the United States altogether, even if they've been vetted for months, even if they've already obtained visas in many cases, even if they've just assisted American troops in overseas conflicts. And that type of truly paranoid mentality makes no sense to me. But I would say the climate of war abroad creates this perpetual war footing. And I don't know when it's going to recede, but I think it's time to start working on individual minds to shift away from that mentality. Yes?
Another thing I was going to say, I brought up Chelsea Manning, and so did you. I don't think everybody knows what that was, so I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on it.
So Chelsea Manning used to be Bradley Manning at the time, and she was a private in essentially U.S. intelligence services.
she had contact with information, classified information, including video footage about Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. And a lot of the major WikiLeaks releases circa late 2009 and 2010 were from Bradley and later Chelsea Manning. And it was interesting because Chelsea Manning had a conversation, an online chat, with a hacker named Adrienne Lamo, and she essentially was saying, well, how would you feel if you knew about all of these horrible atrocities and you couldn't say anything? What would you do? And in the course of that conversation, she confessed that she was the leaker to WikiLeaks. And Adrienne Lamo ended up essentially being a mole for the US government. So essentially they had her confession, she was in the United States, she was court-martialed, and essentially sentenced to indefinite detention until Obama pardoned her shortly before leaving office. And the collateral murder video that I'm referring to was a particular incident during the latter years of the Iraq occupation. I think it happened circa 2007, where essentially there were American pilots overlooking a scene where there were several journalists, and they were carrying camera equipment, and they thought, there are some militants, let's kill them, let's shoot them, and they were laughing about it. And then a van came by to try to help these people as they were struggling, and that van essentially had a father who was taking his children to school. And they shot at that van too, and they were gleeful about it, and they killed and injured many people in that van. So that video, it was a direct display of how, let's say, not every soldier on the battlefield, even when fighting for an ostensibly just cause, is going to have complete restraint and complete righteous motives. I really did think for a while that American troops were bound by strict rules of engagement, and those rules of engagement were you don't intentionally kill civilians, at least not without knowing exactly what it is you're doing, exactly who the targets are, and saying that you regret the collateral damage. Of course, that was a rather naive view of mine at the time, but I think the collateral murder video really drove home the point that there is no such thing as American exceptionalism.
If I just like to comment, you guys can all watch that video on YouTube at any time, and it's no explanation really does it justice until you see it with your own eyes. The kind of carelessness they use to murder innocent civilians, and I mean careless and then remorseless. And even if they were hurting soldiers, they acted like they were just squashing bugs, and it's really disturbing. And I think everybody should watch it just to kind of understand that. So thank you.
Certainly. Yes.
I just wanted to know your opinion about intervention in regards to humanitarian crises. And the one in particular I'm thinking of is the Ugandan genocide.
Yes.
And famously they had a lack of intervention, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Well, I wonder to what extent military intervention in particular could have prevented those deaths. I mean, admittedly, it's a very tragic crisis. And there are circumstances when ethnic or nationalist hatreds escalate to the point where there's just this widespread slaughter and chaos. I'm not sure what having a few troops on the ground could have done to thwart that. If you had 10 people with guns, they might have been overwhelmed. If you had 100,000 people with guns, they might have been doing the overwhelming, and in the chaos of it all, might have crushed many innocent people, as well as perhaps the potential or actual perpetrators of the violence. So again, these occupations bring unintended consequences. And one could give examples of particular circumstances in which soldiers occupying a foreign country have done some good, like saved some civilians from gunfire by insurgents, or even on a macro scale, toppled a dictator. I just don't think on balance that ever justifies the loss of innocent lives and the completely counterproductive consequences that set back human civilization. Now, I'm all for humanitarian assistance, peaceful humanitarian assistance. It's just there are many better ways of doing it than sending in men with guns. Now, one very libertarian policy would be open borders. If people want to flee from those kinds of genocides, those kinds of oppressive regimes, let them in, especially if they want to live peacefully, they specifically want to escape that type of horror. There should be some sympathy with that. If they're thinking the way we're thinking, they want to be here, They want to be productive. They want to contribute to our way of life. That's a great deal. Yes?
A couple specific things. First of all, the open borders would mean that all wars are where the things are to be taken, which would mean that countries with assets would be ground zero, which wouldn't be so good for us. But that's what it's going to end up. The Second World War is a terrible example of anything without a whole lot of research, because what people who were there and people who lived through it, people who were around shortly after that, what they knew of it, which admittedly was missed an awful lot of the story, is completely different than what we've been brainwashed ever since. Even all the documentation we have, photographs and all that, and mislabeled, different victims, or they were created in processes that started completely after the war supposedly ended, and again, they were different victims. It's worth studying because the parallels between Central Europe and America today are beyond terrifying. We spent more than an hour and a half saying the war was bad, and this was an international conclusion that everybody agreed, at least since the end of the First World War. As a matter of fact, war was outlawed since then. What's happened since then is basically now we have a world where the people who want war have to stage false flags to get it. They have to stage false flags to get everything, all the social controls they want within countries. And as a matter of fact, the world cannot be governed by the people who are governing it now without false flags. The first time that it was obvious that no, it can never be ruled that way again was at the World Trade Conference in Seattle in 1999. This was staged in the middle of a country where the middle class at that point had already been almost overwhelmingly just disemboweled. And people were unhappy about that. They had 40,000 protesters who shut down the whole city. And the delegates couldn't get in the building. It was totally ungovernable from the point of view of the ruling elite. And shortly after that, we had 9/11 to take away the freedom to protest. So there was this necessity to intimidate the population became the first pillar of necessity of false flags. The second pillar of necessity of false flags is to defend the petrodollar at all costs. You can see the consequences of that. The third absolute pillar of necessity to govern the world by false flags is this concept of the increasing burden of government and democracy in order to corral public opinion to ever greater costs and burdens and pretexts for governing everything. A pretext is basically, it's a lie that came out of law enforcement that, okay, you're questioning someone, you want to get information out of them, you want to give them a hard time, you just want to intimidate them. So you make up a story of how they did something terrible, and then you challenge them with it. First you say they're lying, and if they can prove they're not lying, or first you say they're doing something criminal, and if they can prove they're not doing something criminal, then they must be lying. And if they're not lying, they must be crazy. Pretty much all our societies run that way right now. We talk about old people sending young people to war, but if you think about all the older people you know, older people, from wherever you were to begin with, the older you get, the more reticent you tend to be towards war. There's a small group of people who are basically at war with the rest of humanity. They're born into it. It's a large part of it's just absolute hatred, and we're serving their purposes. But again, the only way that we can serve their purposes is through false pretexts. So that the idea is not discovering war is bad. The idea is discovering how do we get around false flags.
Well, you mentioned many points. I'll respond to a few of them. I'll take the briefer ones first. Open borders doesn't mean letting in criminals or militant groups. It's letting in anybody who is peaceful, and it doesn't preclude domestic law enforcement. Like today, a police officer can arrest you if you commit theft, or if you commit murder, or if you commit a white-collar crime. That would apply to any immigrant who comes into this country for any reason with any security system or no security system at all at the border. With regard to World War II, I agree that there was a lot of propaganda at that time within the Allied countries as well. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt had to institute policies to suppress domestic dissent, modeled after the propaganda initiatives of Woodrow Wilson, whom he greatly admired. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I,
and he wanted to emulate that propaganda apparatus even during times of peace, during the New Deal. And he certainly deployed that in World War II as well. I do think Hitler was a lot worse than Roosevelt. I do think that somebody would have had a right of self-defense against Hitler. Now, my family comes from Belarus. Belarus is formerly a Soviet country. It was on the front lines of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And essentially a quarter of the population was destroyed by Hitler's invasion. But Russian high command had essentially a cannon fodder-oriented strategy, send waves and waves of people at the German army and get them mowed down, but enough of them will make it and enough of them will overwhelm the Germans. And as a result of this recklessness, this absolute recklessness, they probably sacrificed more of their own people than Hitler could have deliberately intended to kill. So if I were in that position, if I were a resident of Belarus or Western Russia in 1941 or 1942, my choice would have been to flee to Siberia if I could have found a way to escape the very severe retribution that the Stalinist regime had in place for alleged deserters or even people who wavered. Stalin actually deployed men with machine guns at the back of the lines of Russian troops that were sent forward to attack the German positions, just in a frontal attack, but if the troops fled, they'd be mowed down by the machine guns from the rear. So that's a really terrible place to be. That's not you standing up for your homeland and somehow fighting off an aggressor in a justified war. That's you being coerced to die in command. So that's one reason why I don't think that resistance strategy is effective at all. Now, what you said with regard to false flags, there have been some of them in U.S. history, the sinking of the USS Maine. At least, I think it happened as an accident based on all of the historical evidence, but the framing of the Spanish government that led to the Spanish-American War of 1898 was a deliberate, you could say, false flag attempt. A lot of the time, these kinds of events are just convenient justifications. In my view, the September 11th terrorist attacks were definitely real terrorist acts perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. There's no question about that. Were they a convenient justification for certain policies that would have been implemented anyway if there were another sufficiently, let's say, momentous event to justify them? Probably. But I would also say governments don't have as tight of a control as any theory of a top-down conspiracy would imply. We've seen recent election. There is, let's say, no better connected political establishment than the one that backed Hillary Clinton for president, and yet she lost. She lost despite having an overwhelming fundraising advantage over Donald Trump. And I am by no means a fan or a supporter of Trump either, because I think Trump plays on some of the worst tendencies in the American public. But it shows that an elite group of politicians doesn't really have as much control as they think they do. They have certain levers they can push, but the world is a lot more complex than that. And that gives us an opening. It gives us an opening with the ordinary tools that we have as ordinary people to try to change public opinion, and with that try to change policy. And sometimes you have genuinely decent people in power. Eisenhower is a good example. I don't agree with all of his policies, but I think he was of a sober mind with regard to war, probably because he saw it in great detail and he understood what war entailed and he tried to warn the American people against it. There was a question in the back.
Yeah, it was already answered with, I was trained to our civil liberties as well, is that it's justifiable by all these politicians in power that, hey, there's this terrorist attack happening and obviously our civil liberties must be sacrificed for the greater good. And again, I was just going to say, like, that all ties back to, what's it saying that you always say? Good intentions lead.
Oh yeah, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right. So that was just basically what I was going to add into it.
I can certainly agree with that. Now, you had a question.
So open borders, wouldn't that not be such a good thing? So I mean, you're letting people in for safety, but what about the people who can't afford to come over? So shouldn't we help them over in their country to make it a safer place for them instead of accepting them to the United States?
Well, I would say in many cases it is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve some sort of universal abstract conception of justice. Ideally, we'd want all people to have clean drinking water, yet there's a large fraction, already a minority, but a large fraction of the world's population that doesn't have access to that. And there's a lot of historical path dependency that has to go into that, but I'm very skeptical of attempts to centrally re-engineer that. Now, it's one thing to say, if you know of a particular family in Syria or in Sudan or in the Congo that needs help, and you want to send your resources to help them or sponsor an aid organization that wants to do that, or even sponsor their arrival in the United States for whatever reason. Maybe they have skills, and maybe you're an employer who wants to hire them. That's one way to exercise that kind of benevolence. But it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis by the people who know, as the great Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek would put it, the circumstances of time and place. Because if you try to impose an overarching centralized framework on that, there are bound to be unintended consequences, and some people's lives may be ruined. Again, if you're focused on something particular, if you think that deploying a 100,000-man-strong army is going to help family X from Syria escape being slaughtered, you might be right. But what about families Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, and F? What will happen to them? So I think with that kind of caution in mind, more targeted efforts by individuals or voluntary groups to help other individuals are more effective. Yes, you had a question.
What responsibility do you think mass media bears for this current crisis that we're involved in?
I would say mass media often, let's say, are lazy, and they can regurgitate talking points from anybody with an agenda. And it could be a situation where even they want to seem impartial, so they say, well, side X says this, but side Y says something different. And there could be an overwhelming weight of evidence in favor of one side or the other or neither side, but there's this perception, oh, we need to give equal time to everybody. So you could envision a situation where the proponents of foreign intervention X bring up this whole host of reasons, and then there are some who oppose it. And we've seen that coverage, say, in the wake of the Second Gulf War, where the media were saying, well, Colin Powell just gave this speech before the United Nations where he laid out the case that the regime of Saddam Hussein has all these weapons of mass destruction. Now, some people disagree. There are protests in the streets. They say, no blood for oil, etc. But there's this temptation to just regurgitate rather than critically evaluate, rather than say, okay, this is what the evidence actually suggests in this, and although Colin Powell made this case, there are reasons to be skeptical. If the media had done that, I think we might be in a different place right now with regard to the Iraq occupation. Yes?
I was wondering, because the majority of America's philosophy of foreign policy was isolationism, I was wondering whether the change from isolationism to a more interventionist foreign policy was in part due to presidents or leaders lacking the experiences of actually being in a war. I mean, you have earlier in American history, in the 19th century, there's people like Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Tyler, who actually had experiences fighting for the United States, and they do their atrocities of war. But then you get into the early 20th century, where you didn't have as many presidents who were experienced in that or do the atrocities. And going well into the 20th century, you have people who had absolutely no experience in war. So I want to hear your opinion about that.
It's interesting that you bring that up because there's at least a strong correlation with regard to the claim that you're trying to make. Even some of the earlier wars in American history, say the groundwork for the War of 1812, even though it happened during the term of James Madison, was most likely laid by, of all people, Thomas Jefferson, who really should have known better, especially when he imposed his embargo of 1807, which essentially prohibited the United States from trading with the rest of the world. Talk about extreme protectionism by which any subsequent trade policy pales in comparison. Some of the most cataclysmic wars in American history were indeed fought during the tenures of civilian presidents. Abraham Lincoln was an attorney. Franklin Roosevelt was a career politician in essence, but upper-class, elite New Yorker. Lyndon Johnson was also a career politician. Yes, you can think of military generals who became presidents who generally didn't wage destructive wars. Dwight Eisenhower ended the Korean War, for instance. And there are many other examples. Ulysses Grant didn't start any wars. Zachary Taylor didn't start any wars, though he was a hero of the Mexican War. So there's a correlation. I don't think that's a necessity, though, for an individual to have direct experience in war. As the great French 19th century classical economist Frédéric Bastiat wrote, there are two great teachers in life, experience and foresight. And one would hope to have the benefit of the latter because the former is a lot harsher. So I would say probably the ex-military presidents learned a lot from their experience. But we would hope that in the future, especially if we achieve our goal of making wars a lot less frequent, those future presidents will have the benefit of foresight, as well as the lessons of history.
I want to make one quick comment. You studied a lot of the stuff going on with the war and humanitarian issues, and it's very commendable. And I know you absolutely totally mean really well and all that. You're still scratching the surface, and because of that, if I was to refute all the things you said in response, just to explain what it was, it would take days or weeks. But you said one thing that got real close to reality, and I just wanted to respond to that. And that was when you were talking about the battle lines going through Belarus. The Soviet army always was two armies. There was the Slavic people, which would include basically the population of Belarus, which was the frontline army. And there was a behind-the-line army of the people who actually ran the Soviet Union, who were not Slavs. From their point of view, from the point of view of Stalin and his command, all the civilian population, including women and children, were in the same category as the frontline army, and he fought the war accordingly. The scary thing is, those same people who were making those decisions and running things that way were also key decision makers in the Nazi government and the other European governments that were at war. And the same group is in control of our government now, leading to, over and over again, in one form or another, the same results.
Well, I would disagree that they're the same group, that they're affiliated in some ways. I'd say there's a dynamic of power whereby the worst tend to rise to the top, especially in more authoritarian structures, in structures that involve greater regimentation, a greater degree of government power over the economy and over individual lives. And it's essentially a vicious form of competition, where the more brutal you are, the fewer scruples you have, the more readily you eliminate your rivals, the likelier it is that you rise to the top. That's why in every major revolution, the revolution might start with idealists who genuinely want a better world and want to overthrow a suboptimal regime, replace it with something more just. But in completely, let's say, disturbing the conventional restraints that exist in that society, the rules of engagement by which you can't say, I'll designate a champion, you designate a champion, they'll fight it out, or they'll talk it out, and that will be the solution to our problems. If those norms are eroded, you get this progressive increase in the lengths to which people are willing to go, the amount of violence they're willing to increase, until the worst of the worst gets to the top, and that's your Hitler or your Stalin. I don't think we're there yet in the United States. For all of the absurdities and sometimes the horrific suggestions that Donald Trump has made, I don't think he's nearly at that level yet. And there are still a lot of civil institutions of American society, as well as other branches of government, that can keep him in check. And ourselves. We can still speak out, and we, public opinion, are also
a societal norm that can prevent the erosion of other norms. So that would be my response to you.
All right, let's get a round of applause.